For 62 years, I carried a secret that burned like hot coals in my chest. Until that Tuesday morning, when my daughter Margaret brought a pile of documents for us to organize, I knew the time had finally come. She had no idea that those yellowed papers would change everything she thought she knew about herself. The mantel clock struck 9 when I heard the familiar sound of Margaret's Honda Civic pulling into the driveway. Through the lace curtain in the living room window, I watched her get out of the car carrying a red shoebox, the same one where I'd kept important documents for decades. My right hand began trembling more than usual, making the teacup clink against the saucer. The lavender scent from the sachet Margaret had placed in my closet last week mixed with the smell of old paper that always permeated our Victorian house. The floorboards creaked under her firm steps. She'd always been a decisive woman, even at 62. I heard her keys searching for the lock, followed by the metallic sound of the door opening. "Mom, I'm here," she called from the entrance, just like she had since childhood. My heart raced, not from the surprise of her arrival. I was expecting her, but from the box in her hands. For years, I'd avoided opening that box completely. I'd always just pull out whatever document I needed and close it quickly, as if it were Pandora's box that shouldn't be disturbed. Now, with the Parkinson's diagnosis weighing over us like a dark cloud, Margaret had decided it was time to get everything in order. She couldn't understand why I resisted the idea so much. How could I explain that some papers held secrets that could destroy the only family she'd ever known? The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air. On the bookshelf, family photographs watched us silently, carefully selected images that told only part of our story. Margaret appeared in the living room doorway with her usual efficient smile, but I could see the concern in her brown eyes when she noticed my trembling hand. "Let's do this together, Mom," she said, placing the box on the mahogany coffee table we'd inherited from my mother, "while you can still help me understand everything." If only she knew how much I understood about those papers, and how much I feared she would understand too. "My name is Eleanor Walsh. I'm 78 years old, and this house in Cedar Falls has been my refuge for 55 years. When we arrived here in 1967, I was just a young 22-year-old with a 5-year-old baby sister to care for. At least, that was the story we told the neighbors. Margaret grew up in this living room, crawling on the Persian rug we'd bought at a clearance sale, climbing on the navy blue velvet sofa she called Soft Mountain. She'd always been an organized child, even when small. At 6, she was already arranging her toys in perfect rows. At 12, she'd cataloged our entire library. It was no surprise when she became supervisor of the county public records department. Throughout all these years, we maintained our quiet, comfortable routine. I worked as a secretary at the elementary school. Margaret studied, married David, had her own children, Jennifer and Michael, and always treated me like the mother I officially wasn't. The irony never stopped hurting. Our parents, James and Helen Walsh, died when Margaret was in her 40s. They took the secret to their graves, as we'd agreed decades ago. During the funeral, Margaret held my hand and said, "Now it's just the two of us, Mom." She didn't even realize she'd called me Mom instead of sister. In that moment, I almost told her the truth. Almost. The house was full of carefully constructed memories. On the mantel shelf, photographs showed our family, me holding baby Margaret, our proud parents beside us. In the photos, I always appeared as the responsible older sister, never as the teenage mother I really was. I learned to smile for cameras while hiding the pain of not being able to claim my true role. Margaret had developed a solid, respected career. She knew every civil registration law, every administrative procedure, every type of mistake that could happen in registries. She was meticulous, detail-oriented, and had an impressive memory for bureaucratic inconsistencies. These qualities I'd always admired in her now terrified me. 6 months ago, when the neurologist confirmed the Parkinson's diagnosis, Margaret immediately took practical control of the situation. She researched treatments, reorganized my house to facilitate mobility, established an exercise routine. But the part that worried me most was her insistence on organizing all the important paperwork. "Mom, you have to think about the future," she'd said last week, while I tried to postpone our organization session once again. "What if you need special care? What if I need to make medical decisions for you? I need to know where all the documents are." She was right, of course. She always was. But how could I explain that some documents were time bombs I'd spent decades trying to keep buried? For years, Margaret had casually asked about our family, our history, our move from Portland to Cedar Falls when she was little. I always gave vague answers. Your parents wanted a fresh start. Portland wasn't working out for your father's business. You were too young to remember. She accepted my explanations because she trusted me completely. Now, watching her prepare to open that red box, I knew vague answers would no longer be enough. Margaret had inherited the Walsh persistence, a trait I knew well because it was my inheritance too. The house felt different that morning, quieter, as if it were holding its breath along with me. The kitchen wall clock made its constant tick-tock, counting the seconds until the moment I dreaded for more than 6 decades. Margaret opened the box carefully, as she always did with important things. The smell of old paper spread through the room, bringing with it memories of a time when I was young, in love, and terribly naive about the consequences of loving the wrong person. "Let's start with the official documents," Margaret said with her characteristic efficiency. "Certificates, deeds, medical records." My heart nearly stopped when I saw what was on top of the pile. Margaret worked with the precision of a professional archivist, separating documents into small piles on the coffee table. Old vaccination certificates, decades-old tax receipts, photographs mixed with official papers, everything received her meticulous attention. "Mom, did you really keep your elementary school vaccination card?" she asked, holding up a yellowed card. "From 1970, that's impressive even by my organizational standards." I tried to appear relaxed, sipping my tea, but my eyes couldn't look away from her hands as she handled the papers. At any moment, she would find what I feared most. And here we have— Oh. Margaret stopped talking abruptly. She was holding 2 sheets of paper, both with official appearance, both with stamps and seals. Her eyebrows furrowed as she compared the documents, turning them over, examining them against the window light. "Mom," she said, with that careful tone she used when she discovered something unusual at work, "can you explain why I have 2 birth certificates?" The world seemed to stop. The tick-tock of the clock got louder. The creak of the wooden floor under my feet seemed to echo through the entire house when I leaned forward. "Let me see that, dear," I said, extending my trembling hand. Margaret handed me the papers carefully, as if they were made of crystal. I already knew what I would see, but even so, I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. The first certificate was folded at the corners, a bit faded, but still legible. Margaret Walsh, born March 15, 1962, Cedar Falls, Iowa. Parents, Eleanor Walsh and Robert Walsh. Robert Walsh was a name I'd invented at the time, a masculine version of my own middle name, Rose. The second certificate was better preserved, carefully kept in a plastic folder. Margaret Walsh, born March 15, 1962, Portland, Oregon. Parents, James Walsh and Helen Walsh. "The date is the same," Margaret observed, "but everything else is different. The parents, the birthplace, even the stamps are from different states." My mouth was dry as cotton. "It must be some kind of administrative error, dear. You know how things were back then. Registries made mistakes frequently." But Margaret was already shaking her head before I finished speaking. "Mom, I've worked with this for 30 years. This isn't an administrative mix-up." She pointed to specific details on the documents. "Look at the issue dates. This one from Portland was issued in 1962, right after birth. This one from Cedar Falls was issued in 1967, 5 years later." I could hear my own heart beating. "And there's more," Margaret continued, her voice taking on that investigative tone I knew well. "This older one has stamps from St. Mary Hospital in Portland. But you always told me I was born at Memorial Hospital here in Cedar Falls." Well, I stood up from the armchair, pretending I needed more tea. "Things get confusing with time, dear. Maybe I got mixed up. Mixed up about where your own sister was born?" The word sister sounded strange in the air. Margaret rarely called me sister. Throughout her life, she instinctively called me Mom, and I never corrected her. Only in the most formal situations, when other people were present, did she force herself to use sister. "And there's something else," Margaret said, picking up a 3rd sheet from the box. "This birth certificate lists you as mother, not as sister. Eleanor Walsh, mother. But if you were my sister, she looked at me with that expression I'd known since she was little, the same one she made when she knew I was hiding something important. Mom, she said, using the word she always used when being serious with me, I need you to tell me the truth. Which of these certificates is correct? I returned to the armchair, feeling the weight of 62 years on my shoulders. The words I'd rehearsed thousands of times in my mind simply disappeared. It's complicated, was all I could say. Complicated how? Margaret asked, sitting beside me on the sofa. She placed the certificates on the table, side by side, like evidence in a courtroom. My mind raced, trying to construct an explanation that made sense without revealing the complete truth. Well, dear, as I said, things were different back then. Registries made errors, especially when there were interstate moves. But this doesn't explain why one certificate lists you as mother and the other lists our parents, Margaret insisted. And why there's a 5-year difference between the issues. I took a deep breath, preparing my first false clue carefully. When you were born, I was temporarily caring for you. Your parents, our parents, had some health issues at the time. They gave me power of attorney to make decisions for you, including medical matters. Margaret frowned. Health issues? I never heard about this. It was something they preferred not to discuss. You know how Dad was reserved about these things. I hoped she'd accept this explanation. Our family really did have a history of not talking about personal problems. So you registered me as your daughter because of a power of attorney? It was the most practical thing at the time. When we moved to Cedar Falls, the registries here issued a new certificate with the correct names. Margaret picked up the older certificate and examined it again. But this still doesn't explain why you had power of attorney at, let me calculate, 17 years old? My blood ran cold. I'd forgotten Margaret was excellent at math. 17? No, dear. I was 22 when you were born. Mom, Margaret said patiently, if you were born in August 1944, as your birth certificate says, and I was born in March 1962, you were 17, not 22. I could feel sweat forming on my forehead. Well, people sometimes lied about their age back then. Vanity issues, you know. You lied about being 5 years younger? That doesn't make sense, Mom. Before I could answer, Margaret had returned to the box and was looking for something specific. After a few minutes, she found what she was searching for, a black and white photograph. I found this stuck to the bottom of the Portland certificate, she said, showing me the image. It was a photo I hadn't seen in decades. It showed a young woman who was too thin, with dark hair pulled back in a low bun, holding a small baby. The young woman, me, was wearing a hospital gown and looked exhausted. In the background of the photo, partially visible through the window, was a sign, St. Mary Hospital, Portland, Oregon. On the back, written in my mother's careful handwriting, was, Eleanor and Margaret, March 1962. You look 17 in this photo, Margaret said softly. And look at your face, Mom. You don't look like an older sister visiting. You look like a mother who just gave birth. My heart was beating so hard I was sure she could hear it. I needed another false clue, quickly. We were visiting our relatives in Portland at the time, I said, improvising desperately. Aunt Margaret, yes, you were named after her, was sick. Mom had complications during labor, and I ended up helping more than a girl my age should have. That's why I look so tired in the photo. What kind of complications? High blood pressure. It was dangerous back then. I practically lived at the hospital for a week. Margaret nodded slowly, as if processing the information. For a moment, I thought she'd accepted my explanation. Then she said, but if Mom had complications during labor in Portland, why did you always tell me I was born here in Cedar Falls? I felt like I was walking a tightrope over an abyss. Well, dear, you were born during our visit to Portland. It was unexpected. Mom didn't want you to know your birth was complicated. She thought you might blame yourself somehow. Blame myself? Children sometimes do that, you know. Think they caused their parents pain just by being born. Margaret was silent for a long moment, looking at the photograph. I could see her mind working, trying to fit together the pieces of the story I was constructing. Are there more photos from the Portland trip? She asked finally. Not many. It was a difficult period. And our relatives there? Do we still have contact with them? Each question was a trap. No, dear. Aunt Margaret died shortly after your birth. That's what we were there for, remember? After that, we lost touch with the rest of the family. Margaret turned her attention back to the box, looking for more evidence. She found a few more photographs, all from the Portland period. One showed our mother holding Margaret, but she looked strangely uncomfortable with the baby. Another showed our father looking out the hospital window as if he wanted to be anywhere but there. Dad doesn't look very happy in these photos, Margaret observed. It was a stressful time for all of us, I replied quickly. Aunt Margaret's illness, the labor complications, being away from home. But Margaret had found something else in the box. A small, yellowed envelope with my name written on the front in handwriting I recognized immediately. My heart stopped. "What's this?" she asked, starting to open the envelope. "Don't," I said, louder than I intended. "I mean, those are just old letters, nothing important." But it was too late. Margaret had already taken the letter from the envelope and was reading the first lines. I could see her eyes moving across the page, her expression gradually changing from curiosity to confusion, and then to something that looked like shock. "Mom," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "this letter is from someone named Thomas Bradley, and he's talking about you and about a baby." The world around me began to spin. Margaret held the letter with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the lines written in careful, masculine handwriting. I could see glimpses of the letter from where I sat. "Dear Eleanor, our baby, I can't stop thinking about you both." "Mom," Margaret said, her voice controlled but tense. "Who is Thomas Bradley?" I felt like I was at a crossroads. I could continue lying, build another layer of false clues, or start revealing parts of the truth. I chose a dangerous middle ground. "Thomas was a family friend," I said slowly. "He worked for your grandfather." "A family friend who writes letters about our baby?" Margaret turned the letter over, looking for a date. "This is from September 1962, 6 months after my birth." She went back to the box and began searching systematically. To my horror, she found more letters, a small bundle tied with a faded blue ribbon. "How many letters are there?" she asked, undoing the bow. "Margaret, those are private things." "Mom, please. Something is happening here that I don't understand, and these letters seem to have answers." She opened the second letter and read aloud. "Dear Eleanor, I got a better job at a farm in Salem. The pay is almost double. In a few more months, I'll have enough money to rent a small house for our family." Margaret stopped reading and looked directly at me. "Our family? Mom, what is this about?" My mind raced, trying to construct an explanation that wouldn't reveal everything. Thomas was, well, he liked me. He had fantasies about us forming a family, but he was young and too much of a dreamer. He talks about the baby as if he were the father. Some men do that. When they really like a woman, they end up getting attached to her children too. Margaret didn't look convinced. She opened a third letter and read silently. I could see her expression changing as she processed the information. "This one here is from December 1962, she said. "He asks if he can visit you and the baby for Christmas. He says, our little Margaret must be growing so much." She looked at me again. "Why does he call me our Margaret?" I was cornered. I needed to give her an explanation that would satisfy her curiosity without revealing the complete truth. "Margaret," I said, taking a deep breath, "maybe it's time I told you the whole story, or at least part of it." She leaned forward, waiting. "When I was 17, I fell in love with Thomas Bradley. He worked on your grandfather James's farm. He was a good young man, hard-working, but, well, he wasn't from our social class." "Social class?" "Dear, you have to understand. It was 1961, 1962. Things were different. My father owned land, had a respected position in the community. Thomas was just a farmhand, lived in a cabin with his widowed mother." Margaret nodded, beginning to understand. "And you fell in love?" "Yes, deeply. But when my father discovered our relationship, he was furious. Said he'd rather see me dead than married to a vagrant. And then, here came the hardest part. I needed to tell a version of the truth that explained the letters without revealing that Margaret was my daughter. Then I discovered I was pregnant." Margaret was silent for a long moment. "Pregnant?" "But my father kicked Thomas off the property that same week. Said if he showed up there again, he'd call the police." "And the baby?" "I lost the baby in the 3rd month," I lied, feeling each word burn my throat. But Thomas didn't know. He'd been kicked out before I found out I was pregnant, and when I lost the baby, I couldn't bring myself to tell him. Margaret looked at the letters again. So he wrote all these letters thinking you had a baby together? Yes. And since you were born around the same time, and he knew I was taking care of you, well, I think he got confused. Thought you were our daughter. It was an elaborate lie, but plausible. Margaret seemed to be processing the information. Why didn't you ever tell him the truth? Because I was young and stupid, I said. And this part was true. Because I believed what my father said about class differences. Because I thought it would be better for him to move on. Margaret opened another letter. This one dated 1963. But he kept writing for years. He was persistent. And you never responded? In the beginning I answered a few. I tried to explain that we couldn't be together. But he wouldn't accept it. Margaret found a different letter, more official. It was from a law office in Salem, Oregon, dated 1964. Mom, this letter is from a law firm. They're asking about child support? My blood ran cold. I'd completely forgotten about that letter. Thomas thought you didn't want to marry him for financial reasons, I continued, improvising. So he went to court to try to establish a support fund for you and the baby he thought was his. He did that even though he wasn't the father. He didn't know he wasn't the father. Remember, he was kicked out before I told him about the pregnancy, and I lost the baby afterward. He only knew I was taking care of a child, the age our baby would have been. Margaret was shaking her head, trying to understand the whole situation. So, he spent years thinking I was his daughter. Yes. And you never cleared up the misunderstanding? I tried, but at first he didn't believe me. He thought I was lying to protect him from my father's anger. And after a while, I stopped trying. Margaret was quiet for several minutes, looking at the letters scattered on the table. Finally, she asked, "Where is he now?" I don't know. The letters stopped coming in 1964. I think he finally gave up. And you? Do you still think about him? This question caught me off guard. It was impossible to answer without revealing too much about my true feelings. Margaret, that was over 60 years ago. That doesn't answer my question. I looked at the photograph of us at the Portland hospital, then at the letters scattered on the table, and finally at my daughter's questioning face. Yes, I admitted finally. I still think about him. It was the first complete truth I'd told that day, and it hurt more than all the lies combined. Margaret continued examining the letters for a few more minutes, reading passages silently. I could see that something still bothered her, but I couldn't identify what. "Mom," she said finally, "there's something about this story that doesn't make sense." My heart raced again. "What do you mean? If Thomas was kicked out before you told him about the pregnancy, how did he know you were pregnant?" The question hit me like lightning. In my rush to construct a plausible explanation, I'd created a fatal, logical inconsistency. Someone must have told him. Who? You said your father kicked him off the property. How would anyone have contact with him? I could feel the walls closing in around me. Margaret, that was a long time ago. The details get fuzzy. No, Mom. Details don't get fuzzy when you work with documents your whole life. Margaret stood up and began pacing around the room. And there's something else. You said you lost the baby in the 3rd month, but these letters... She picked one up and read again. Our little Margaret must be growing so much. That's not how someone talks about a baby that never existed. I had no answer for that. Margaret stopped pacing and looked directly at me. Mom, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need you to give me an honest answer. I nodded, although I knew I couldn't lie much longer. Is Thomas Bradley my biological father? The silence that followed was deafening. The mantel clock continued its relentless tick-tock. Outside, I heard a car pass on the street, children playing in the nearby park, normal life continuing, while my world crumbled. Yes, I whispered finally. Margaret sat down heavily in the armchair, as if her legs could no longer support her. Then you're my mother. My real mother. Yes. And James and Helen Walsh were my grandparents, not my parents. Yes. And you lied to me about this for 62 years. The accusation in her voice hurt more than I'd imagined possible. Margaret, you have to understand. Things were different back then. I was 17, unmarried. Then tell me the real story, she said, her voice controlled but firm. The whole story. No more lies. I took a deep breath and for the first time in more than 6 decades began telling the complete truth. I fell in love with Thomas in the summer of 1961. He was 19, I was 16. He worked on my father's farm and lived in a small cabin with his mother, who was a widow. The words poured out like water that had been dammed for decades. He was kind, hardworking, a dreamer. He wanted to have his own farm someday, build a house for his family. Margaret listened in silence. We met secretly after his work. We'd talk for hours about our dreams, our plans. He taught me about plants, about animals. I'd never known anyone who looked at the world the way he did. How were you discovered? My mother saw me coming back from one of our meetings. It was December 1961. She told my father that same night. Remembering that night still gave me chills. The shouting, the accusations, the disappointment in my parents' eyes. My father went after Thomas the next day. Said if he came near me again, he'd call the police and make up some charge against him. Back then, a landowner's word was worth much more than a farm worker's. And you were pregnant? I found out 2 weeks after Thomas left. I was terrified, but also happy somehow. It was like I still had a part of him with me. Margaret leaned forward. What happened when you told your parents? My father said I had 2 options: give the baby up for adoption or let them raise the child as their own. If I chose the first option, I could continue being his daughter. If I chose the second, I'd have to pretend to be the child's older sister for the rest of my life. And you chose the second. I couldn't imagine giving you to strangers, but I also couldn't imagine losing my family completely. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, processing everything. And Thomas? Did he know about me? This was the most painful part of the story. He found our address in Portland and came looking for us when you were 6 months old. He wanted to marry me, wanted to claim you as his daughter. And you said no. I said no. Why? The tears I'd held back for decades finally began to fall. Because I was a stupid 17-year-old who believed what my father said about class differences. Because I thought he'd never be able to give us a decent life. Because I was afraid he'd blame me for hiding the pregnancy. Margaret moved to the sofa beside me and took my trembling hand. Mom, she said, using the word with a completely new meaning now. You were a child, a scared child in an impossible situation. I looked at my daughter. I could finally call her my daughter, and saw in her eyes not the anger I expected, but understanding. Do you forgive me? I asked. There's nothing to forgive, she said, squeezing my hand. But now I want to know, where is Thomas Bradley? Margaret left me the next morning with the promise that she would do some research. Knowing my daughter and her professional skills, I knew that meant a complete and systematic investigation. For 3 weeks, she showed up at my house every few days with small updates. Thomas had moved from Salem to Portland in 1965, then to Eugene in 1970, and finally settled in a small town called Silverton in 1975. Each clue Margaret found left me more anxious and hopeful at the same time. Mom, I need to tell you something, she said on a rainy Thursday, sitting beside me in the living room. There was something different in her expression, a mixture of excitement and nervousness. I found him. My heart stopped. Found him? Thomas Bradley. He's alive and lives in a senior community in Silverton, Oregon. I couldn't speak. After so many years wondering where he was, what he was doing, if he still thought about us, discovering he was just a few hours away seemed surreal. How is he? I managed to ask finally. Margaret smiled. According to the community administrator, he's one of the most beloved residents there. Apparently, he had a carpentry workshop until a few years ago, where he taught the trade to young people from the area. He never married? No. The administrator said that when they asked about family, he always answered that he lost the love of his life long ago, but never stopped looking for her. Tears began streaming down my face again. There's more, Margaret continued. When he moved to the community 10 years ago, the first thing he did was ask if anyone knew an Eleanor Walsh from Cedar Falls, Iowa. He was still looking for me? Apparently, yes. The administrator said he posted our old address on his room wall, along with some very old photographs. Margaret took a piece of paper from her purse. She gave me his phone number. If you want. I looked at the paper, as if it were a treasure. The phone number of the man I'd loved and lost over 60 years ago. Do you think he'd want to talk to me? Mom, I already talked to him. My world stopped again. What? I called yesterday. I explained who I was. I told him about the letters, about you, about everything. And? Margaret smiled with tears in her eyes. He cried. He cried for 10 minutes without being able to speak. When he finally composed himself, he asked if you were well, if you were happy, if you still thought about him sometimes. What did you say? I told him the truth, that you thought about him every day. Margaret took my trembling hand. Mom, he wants to see us. He wants to meet the daughter he never got to raise. He wants to talk to the woman he never stopped loving. 2 weeks later, Margaret drove me to Silverton. During the entire 4-hour trip, my stomach was tied in knots from nervousness. What would it be like to see Thomas after so many years? Would he still look like the 19-year-old I'd known? Would I still recognize his eyes, his smile? Sunset Gardens Community was a beautiful, well-maintained complex surrounded by flower gardens. Margaret parked in front of the main building and looked at me with concern. Are you sure you want to do this, Mom? I'm sure, I replied, although my hands were trembling more than usual. The administrator, a kind woman named Carol, met us in the reception area. He's waiting in the garden, she said, guiding us through well-lit corridors. I should warn you that he's very nervous. He's barely slept since he found out you were coming. When we reached the garden, I saw him before he saw us. He was sitting on a wooden bench under a tree, wearing a light blue shirt and dark pants. At 81, Thomas still had straight, proud posture. His hair was completely white now, and there were wrinkles around his eyes. But when he turned his face in our direction, I immediately recognized the man I'd loved. Eleanor, he said, standing up from the bench. His voice was deeper than I remembered, but it still had that gentleness that had always calmed me. Thomas. We looked at each other for a moment that seemed to last an eternity. Then he looked at Margaret and smiled, the same shy smile I remembered. You must be Margaret, he said, extending his hand to her. You're even more beautiful than I imagined. Margaret shook his hand and smiled. It's a pleasure to finally meet my father. Thomas looked at me with an expression of amazement. She knows? She knows everything, I replied. I finally told her the truth. He nodded slowly. 62 years is a long time to keep a secret. Too long, I agreed. Thomas looked at Margaret again. Would you mind if I talked to your mother alone for a few minutes? Margaret left us and went to talk to Carol about the community's history. Thomas invited me to sit on the bench beside him. Eleanor, he said, I never blamed you for what happened. You were very young, in an impossible situation. I should have fought harder for us, I said. I should have been braver. You were brave enough to raise our daughter and give her a good life. That's all that matters. We looked at Margaret, who was laughing at something Carol had told her. She grew up well, Thomas said. She became a strong, intelligent woman. Yes, she did. And you? Were you happy? It was a difficult question to answer. I had a good life, but I always felt something was missing. Thomas took my hand carefully, as if it were made of porcelain. It's never too late to make up for lost time. 3 months have passed since that first meeting in Silverton. Margaret drives there every week to visit Thomas, sometimes taking me along, sometimes going alone to build her own relationship with her father. Yesterday, she came back from one of those visits with a thoughtful expression. You know what he told me today? She asked, sitting beside me in the living room where it all began. What? That he never regretted looking for me, even knowing you had chosen another life. He said true love isn't about possessing someone, it's about wanting that person to be happy. Margaret paused, playing with her purse strap. And then he asked me something interesting. He asked if I thought you'd be happy living in a couple's community. My heart raced. What did you say? I said only you could answer that. I looked around the living room, at the carefully organized photographs, at the furniture I'd known for decades, at the life I'd built alone. Then I thought about Thomas, sitting in the community garden, still waiting for an answer I'd taken 60 years to give. Margaret, I said finally, would you mind if your elderly mother moved to Oregon? She smiled. Mom, you're 78 years old. It's time to stop living for others and start living for yourself. Last week, I visited Sunset Gardens again, this time to see the double apartment that becomes available next month. It's small but cozy, with a balcony that overlooks the garden where Thomas likes to sit every morning. It's not exactly the life we planned when we were 19 and 17, he said, as we walked through the community corridors. No, I agreed, but maybe it's even better. Now we know the value of what we're choosing. Thomas stopped walking and looked at me. Eleanor, are you sure? After all these years, after everything that happened? I looked at this man who had waited for me for more than 6 decades, who had forgiven my choices without ever asking for explanations, who had welcomed our daughter as if they'd never spent a day apart. I'm sure, I replied. Next week, I'm moving to Oregon. Margaret will help me pack the things from this house full of memories. We'll keep Thomas's letters in a special album, no longer as evidence of a secret, but as a reminder of a love that withstood time. Sometimes, the best stories don't have an ending. They just get a new beginning when we find enough courage to turn the page. And at 78, I discovered it's never too late to start the chapter that should have always been written.